record. Okay. I hit live, enable auto transcription. Okay, and now I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you all see my slides?
Yes.
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 Okay, great. Okay, so we are in the start of week 5, and we are on the module for the World Bank Group. This week, at the end of the week, there's also due an assignment, the final assignment, assignment 3. So any questions or comments about anything that we have covered so far?
I have 2 dates on the assignments that's due this week, one on the 20th and one on the 27th, which is actual due date.
Wait a minute, there's more than one date?
Did anyone else see that?
I just checked today. I think I just see one date, but let me double check.
It should be. It should be due Monday, the 21st at 12:59 a.m.
So Professor Zagaris, I've got on the week 5 writing assignment, when I clicked on Canvas, it shows February 20th at 4 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Oh, okay.
I have that as well. It's in the body of the assignment. That's what's written on top of the
Okay.
assignment. The due date shows Sunday by 11:59 p.m.
Okay. Okay, I'll try to change that to conform with what's on the what's on the syllabus. Thanks for bringing that to my attention. Also, a student sent me an email and inquired about the stopping of avocados from Michoacan in Mexico. So I did a announcement today about that matter, and also about the fact that on February 10th, the United States filed the first environmental consultations with Mexico under the new Mexico-Canada, U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. You know, we'll discuss this more in the last week when we talk about economic integration and we talk about the agreement. But it's kind of a development with respect to international environmental enforcement. Essentially, it illustrates how increasingly health and environmental issues are becoming integrated in free trade and, you know, as part of enforcement. And so with respect to the avocados, the problem was that one of the U.S. Department of Agriculture inspectors in Mexico received a threat on his cell phone. And, you know, one of the problems in Michoacan is that the drug cartels are very active, and they hit up the avocado producers for protection money. And there have been some problems with U.S. inspectors before, namely in 2020, one of the Mexican nationals who worked for the Department of Agriculture in Mexico was murdered in outside of Tijuana. And there has been another incident in 2019. A vehicle carrying USDA officials was robbed at gunpoint. And so as a result of all these things, now the Department of Agriculture has suspended inspections until the safety of the inspectors can be guaranteed. So that means no more avocados for Mexico until that problem is resolved. So, they do produce avocados in Southern California and some other places, but I think we'll see the prices of avocados go up quite a bit. So stay tuned. And on the environmental complaint, a new feature of the free trade agreement is that now, unlike before, there's a whole environmental chapter that requires each of the 3 countries to implement 7 different conventions on international conventions, such as what we discussed last week, CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And basically the US says Mexico is violating the agreement. So because they're using big nets that are catching the, what's the name of the species? The vaquita porpoise, who's, it's in big demand in China. So the US has called for consultations. And if the consultations aren't successful, the US can ask for the convening of a dispute panel. And if they show that Mexico is violating the obligation to protect endangered species, the US can get sanctions against Mexico. And interestingly, so far on both issues, the president of Mexico, AMLO, has basically said, well, on the avocados, there's commercial interests. He didn't come out and say what he meant, but impliedly he meant that, okay, the US is just trying to protect its own avocado producers. And also he complained about the environmental consultation, basically saying the US was, it was going too far, and that, there wasn't really, the US was exaggerating this issue. So stay tuned. It's a example now of how increasingly free trade agreements give governments and other stakeholders the right to raise these environmental issues and to force enforcement by the other country. In some cases, the issue has to do with species that are in an economic zone, like in the Gulf of Mexico or in the Pacific. In other cases, it could be endangered species in Mexico. So it's a very broad, the requirements are very broad. They also have to do with, air pollution and water pollution. So if people in Texas can show that the maquiladora plants are not doing, combination of the maquiladora plants and the regulation by the Mexican government, or it could even be a combination of the Mexican government and the Texas or Arizona or New Mexico, California governments, then civil society can try to get one of the governments to to ask for consultation and then dispute resolution. And so this gives a lot more power now to governments and stakeholders that want to enforce environmental rights. So what about the World Bank, though? Why in the hell are we, in a course on white collar crime, why are we talking about the World Bank? I mean, they're just a organization that has to do with loaning money to poor countries, and especially on helping them with infrastructure like roads and dams and canals and highways and so forth. So, why is the World Bank involved in white collar crime? Anybody want to guess? Well, we'll see when the World Bank was
Money
first
laundering?
asked. Yep.
Money laundering?
Yes, go ahead.
No, that's why they would be involved. It'd be a source of money laundering.
Okay. Yep. Money laundering is a good example. So initially in the early 90s, the Financial Action Task Force tried to enlist the IMF in its work, tried to get them to attend and to, jump on the anti-money laundering bandwagon. And at first the World Bank said, what are you doing? Why are you asking us? We don't get into any criminal work. We're an aid organization. So, but then it started thinking more, and it also started getting discussions about the C word, meaning not only criminal, but corruption. And in the late 80s, Peter Eigen, one of the World Bank officials, quit. He said, I'm fed up. The World Bank is not only is it not preventing corruption, but it seems to be facilitating corruption, because we all know that 10% or some percent of all the World Bank loans, they go into the back pockets of the leaders of these developing countries, and it ain't right. And each time I try to get the World Bank to do something, in those days, the president of the World Bank, or not the president, the legal counsel was a guy named Shiharta. He was Egyptian. And he basically said, don't use the C word around here, because our clients, meaning the governments getting the loans, they don't like us trying to take away their money, meaning, the money of the leaders, the little percentages that they got for each loan. And so Peter Eigen quit. He started Transparency International. And he invited me to the inaugural meeting. Unfortunately, I was already contracted by the US agency for, what's it called? Anyway, I was, the US government was sending me to 4 Mexican cities, starting with Tijuana and then Ciudad Juarez, Guadalajara, and Mexico City, to talk about the run up to NAFTA and the fact that NAFTA really didn't cover criminal and law enforcement. And so that meant, I had to talk about what that meant. But anyway, Peter Eigen then formed Transparency International. And then that led to the World Bank starting to reconsider what it was doing. So so it started slowly. It started a law and justice institutions department, and then it started a governance global practice to improve the performance of justice sector institutions and to advise on criminal justice reform and citizen security, and to promote justice development in things like land, natural resource extraction, urban development, and especially in investment. And then it also started helping governments with their own governance, and so it went into, big time, the anti-money laundering regime. It started to, especially after the 2001 terrorist attacks, they adopted action plans to strengthen not only anti-money laundering, but terrorist financial assistance. So for instance, one of the things it did was it started developing handbooks. I don't know, can you all see this book I'm holding up? It's called Suppressing the Financing of Terrorism, a handbook for legal drafting, or legislative drafting. So the IMF legal department, right after 9/11, they started preparing a how-to legislate terrorist financing. The World Bank also developed, both the World Bank and the IMF developed a financial integrity unit to provide, and I have a hyperlink to it, to provide client countries with tools to increase transparency and to prevent and pursue illicit financial flows, to reinforce the integrity of the financial system. So there are about 20 or 25 lawyers in each of the units, and they only have contracts for 1 or 2 years, but they're from all around the world, and they help governments then with technical assistance to better work with respect to anti-money laundering. The Financial Integrity Group or unit also houses what's called the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, which has the acronym STAR, and I've hyperlinked that. And that's a partnership between the World Bank and the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. And that's to support international efforts to end safe haven for corrupt funds. So it works with developing countries to do everything from helping them draft legislation. It gives them support on cases. It gives them, it helps them build their capacity. So for instance, it does all kinds of useful handbooks. 2 handbooks that it's done. One is called Asset Recovery Handbook, a Guide for Practitioners. So it's all about like the strategic considerations for developing and managing a case, securing evidence and tracing assets, managing assets subject to confiscation, mechanisms for confiscation, international cooperation in asset recovery, civil proceedings, and it has all kinds of sample documents on like planning the execution of a search and seizure warrant, sample document production order for financial institutions, sample financial profile form. So it's a very useful guide. So it recently did an update. It also published a book called Left Out of the Bargain: Settlements in Foreign Bribery Cases and Implications for Asset Recovery. So that book is all about, it's basically a critique of countries like the US and the UK and Canada, and the fact that in many of these large transnational corruption cases, where there are huge penalties and settlements, how those countries share very little of the penalties and the proceeds with the developing countries. And basically, it tells, it basically recommends that those countries do a better job of sharing in assets and proceeds confiscated and forfeited. And it gives some innovative ways, such as, okay, if you think Nigeria is too corrupt so that you can't return the money to the Nigerian government, then at least share it with a civil society organization in Nigeria with oversight provisions, so that that civil society organization can only use the money for discrete poverty reduction programs. So that's, some of the work on how the World Bank and the IMF try to then build capacity. They also put out, well, let's see. Yeah, so they help then in designing, programs to have better laws on things like asset disclosure systems. So for instance, they've put out a little guide called Using Asset Disclosure for Identifying Politically Exposed Persons. And so the booklet talks about how these laws on asset disclosure should work. And it also talks about all kinds of procedures, such as unless you require the politically exposed persons to make their disclosures online, then it's going to be more difficult to use that information later on in investigating them. And so it goes through also, best practices, for instance, in having asset disclosure systems for public officials. It also discusses things like best practices around new financial products, such as mobile money or cyber assets. It also, the World Bank Group has a global dialogue series where they talk about various issues, and it's especially designed for developing countries. They also give country assistance strategy. So the way that works is that now the IMF, they on a regular basis make investigations and reports on how their members are observing standards, international standards and codes. So now those assessments include anti-money laundering and other governance issues. such as accountability and having proper governance systems for keeping track of the government's own money. So, this is a big problem in countries like Suriname, where recently there was a huge hole in the money held by the government, and the two high-level people in the Suriname Central Bank were prosecuted and convicted. The former governor of the central bank and who then became Minister of Finance was also charged, but he's now a fugitive. And so for countries like Suriname, the IMF wants to deliver best practices on how to prevent those types of embezzlement from happening, and also, if they request, would also give instruction on asset recovery with respect to the money that was allegedly embezzled. So the World Bank then helps with coordination of technical assistance, and when the IMF engages in the monitoring and consultation, it gives a very detailed report, and it will say, look, your country has severe problems in its financial integrity systems and your financial governance systems, and we recommend A, B, and C. You've got to, adopt some legislation. You need some regulations. You need better training. And if you want to borrow more money from us, a condition of further lending will be fulfillment of the conditionalities of our new lending, which will be to improve your governance. Or it may also say that, look, we see that your country has a lot of high net worth individuals, and yet our data shows that you are not collecting much revenue from them. When we loan you money, we have to go to the market to get this money. It doesn't grow on trees. And therefore, if you want to come back and borrow any more money, a conditionality of the current loan is that you have to start collecting revenue from your high net worth individuals. That's the type of way, one of the ways that the World Bank Group will get leverage over its members in order to convince them to undertake this work. And the World Bank Group also periodically conducts research and publishes guides on anti-money laundering, counterterrorism, financing. So for instance, when the FATF 40 recommendations included the recommendation that each country must have a financial intelligence unit, the IMF published a guide on financial intelligence units, the different types of financial intelligence units, such as the one like the US has, where the FIU receives reports such as suspicious activity reporting, but in the US, the FIU isn't empowered to start conducting searches in criminal investigations and prosecuting. Instead, the FIU just shares that information with other law enforcement groups, whether it be, the FBI, the U.S. attorney's offices. And whereas in other countries, the FIUs, when they receive suspicious activity reports and other intelligence reports of money laundering, they can actually conduct criminal investigations, and they can even do prosecutions. So, the IMF will produced a book on different types of FIUs, so that whatever country wants to get the knowledge can determine how they want to develop, how they want to structure the framework for their FIUs. So, and sometimes the IMF will send officials for months to a developing country, to help them start or reorganize and develop better their FIUs. The IMF also published a guide on hawalas, the money remittance systems in Asia and the Middle East. And so that guide was on the types of hawalas and the different ways that you should regulate them. Another very useful guide that the IMF published was something that I used, Preventing Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing, a practical guide for bank supervisors. So that basically tells bank supervisors how to conduct risk management in terms of anti-money laundering, both the licensing process, off-site supervision, on-site supervision, corrective measures such as enforcement. And it also has in the back all kinds of useful guides on, for instance, how to do an on-site examination, and so forth. So I used it when I had to advise the FIU in Jamaica. I was sent by the Inter-American Development Bank for a couple of years. And one of the things I had to do was redo their regulations. I had to review the way that they were doing their supervision, their auditing, and I helped them, redo their audit system, including their examination manuals. And then I actually conducted some training on, where we did some role playing on examinations. So, so then also the Financial Stability Board it's not quite part of the World Bank, but it is very close to it. And Financial Stability Board was created as a result of one of the G7 recommendations in 1998, basically as a result of one of the contagions, the financial contagions arising out of Asia. The World Bank group said, we need a financial stability board to help with those non-bank financial institutions, many of which have worldwide practices. It might be insurance, pensions, security the security brokers. There's a host of non-bank financial institutions. And so the Financial Stability Board works through regions and helps develop soft standard guidelines for the regulation of those non-bank financial institutions. So in terms of transnational corruption, I mentioned in 1993 how Peter Eigen quit. And then in 1996, when Wolfensohn was president, he gave his famous Cancer of Corruption speech. He established, or the World Bank established 2 years later, an oversight committee on fraud and corruption. And then in 2001, they established the Institutional Integrity Department, which is known as INT. You've got a hyperlink to it. And they investigate, or wait, maybe I guess I just underscored it. I didn't actually hyperlink it, but you can easily find it. So the INT investigates allegations of fraud and corruption in the World Bank Group financed operations, and it pursues sanctions when wrongdoing is found. So, and in 2007, Paul Wolfowitz, who some of you may recall was the Assistant Secretary of Defense in the George W. Bush administration and was very active in the Gulf II war. He later on was appointed by President Bush as the World Bank president. And he said he was going to really ramp up anti-corruption in the bank, but he had to ironically resign due to ethical issues, including he arranged a generous pay and promotion for his longtime companion, Suzanne Folsom, who was with the World Bank, and he chose her to head the new INT. And everybody said, well, wait a minute, that's your companion. How could you, appoint her to run the INT? This is not very transparent and ethical. And eventually, as a result of that, he had to resign himself. So in one of the videos that you have in Canvas, it talks about the cross-debarment program. It also talks about how the World Bank Group, along with other international organizations and civil society, have partnered an international corruption hunters alliance. So there's a about a 3-minute video about the first meeting of the International Corruption Hunters Alliance. That exemplifies what we talked about in the first module, in the first chapter of the text, which is international enforcement networking. So here you've got these anti-corruption officials from different organizations all coming together and developing a network, talking about how all of them can work together to make anti-corruption work better. And one of the things they all decided that would work is citizen engagement. So the World Bank and other multilateral development banks try to use, or not try, they use part of their funds to promote civil society anti-corruption organizations so that they can partner in developing countries with civil society in the event the government goes corrupt, and the government will not be a good partner. So and sometimes the World Bank conditions financing natural resource projects with paying royalties for natural resources to a special fund that's going to be transparent and going to be used only for impoverishment projects. I should say impoverishment reduction projects, as opposed to going into the pockets of the leaders. So the IMF has also done all kinds of guides on promoting good governance and combating corruption, such as having transparent accounts so that everybody in the country and even people outside the country can see what's going on. Another similar example is the extractive industry, what do they call it? Extractive industry transparency, a project which the OECD has pioneered. It makes multinational corporations publish the amounts that they pay to developing countries to extract natural resources and to provide details on where that money is going, so that it will enable civil society to spot irregular payments. And the World Bank Group has also pioneered procurement reform. So again, the idea is for public procurement, and infrastructure projects to be more transparent as a way, again, to reduce and prevent corruption. Also, the World Bank Group fights corruption by its suspension, debarment, and blacklisting program. Fiscal year 2018, the World Bank debarred or otherwise sanctioned 83 firms and individuals, and they recognized 73 cross debarments from other multilateral development banks. You can look at the hyperlink to the World Bank Sanctions Board. Just in the past week, the World Bank has published a 4-page Sanctions Board Insights. It shows, and I have it hyperlinked in case you want to look at it. It shows that they now have 3,900 cases in its law digest. So you can see these are 3,900 sanctions cases, and they show 90 decisions published recently, and they give statistics on all kinds of different sanctions cases, and including they give highlights of 2 recent decisions on sanctions, including a decision where one of the entities that was getting a World Bank contract did not properly disclose its subcontractors. And when the World Bank tried to investigate, they didn't cooperate. So when you bid on a World Bank project, one of the requirements is that if there is an allegation of wrongdoing, you've got to wholeheartedly cooperate. They didn't, And the summary says that not only did they not cooperate, but they obstructed, their staff gave false statements, et cetera, et cetera. And so they now are debarred for 6 years and 6 months. And the decision, shows that you get punished heavily if you don't cooperate and instead you try to obstruct. So, and you can see that, what happens is initially there's an investigation, and in most of the cases, the Office of Suspension and Debarment, they determine there's sufficient evidence to support at least one of the claims. And then if the entities that are subject to the complaint do not settle, it goes to a hearing, a proceeding, after which the judges make a determination of whether there's liability, and then what the sentence should be. There's also a whistleblower provision, so you can anonymously give either online or just by phone. You can make a whistleblower complaint. And so, this has been very effective. And the World Bank Group also gives technical assistance. Oh, there's also voluntary compliance. So, the way that works is that if an entity does something wrong in terms of one of these bids, and the company learns of it, maybe it's a whistleblower in the company, or maybe they even read something in the newspaper, or they can come into the bank and say, okay, we want to make a voluntary disclosure. Last year when we bid on this project, we weren't clean about our subcontractor, or we didn't tell you that we bribed one of the officials in the developing country that was getting the loan in order to get the contract. And so if an entity does voluntary compliance, then they're given a more lenient sentence. And that means that if a number of multinational enterprises were doing similar things and they don't do a voluntary compliance, they may be in jeopardy, because one of the requirements of voluntary compliance is you've got to come clean not only on your own company, but on all the other companies that have been participating in these bids. And so that means that there's more pressure now on companies to come forward. My firm handled one of the initial voluntary compliance cases. And also, what the World Bank does is also followed by all the other multilateral development banks. So the Inter-American Development Bank has its own programs, both for sanctions and also for giving technical assistance. So that's how the Inter-American Development Bank hired me to help the Jamaica Financial Services Commission. The Asia Development Bank, the Caribbean Development Bank, the African Development Bank, they all have similar programs. So the World Bank Group also serves as a forum for developing commitments and adopting obligations. They also help to strengthen compliance and enforcement by, strengthening self-regulatory bodies. They will also both give technical assistance, and they will sometimes suspend assistance due to corruption, as happened in Afghanistan due to the Kabul bank problem, where the brother of at the time, the Afghan prime minister and other cabinet officials were involved in the corruption of Kabul bank. So they also help with things like data analytics. So in 2018, the IMF adopted a new anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, tax transparency, and good governance framework. It had 4 elements: fiscal governance, financial sector oversight, central bank governance and operations, market regulation, rule of law, and anti-money laundering, terrorist financing. So, so the World Bank gets involved then in assessing, giving policy advice, providing capacity development, and also helping with oversight over the private sector. Yeah, that's then a quick discussion of the World Bank Group work on anti-money laundering and anti-corruption. So this interestingly, there's still, despite all the progress of the anti-corruption initiatives in the World Bank Group, there is still a lot of, according to some people, still a lot of additional progress that can be made. So for instance, recently, about a year and a half ago, there's a Belgian woman who headed INT, and she was dismissed. And apparently, although the reason given by the bank for her dismissal was, rather vague. Some of my friends who are familiar with the World Bank INT say one of the reasons she was dismissed was she took her job too seriously, and she aggravated a number of countries and even some of the people in the World Bank who, you got to remember that at its core, the World Bank Group is still trying to give money, make loans so that infrastructure projects can be done. And so, this anti-corruption, anti-money laundering program, while it's a core part of the work of the World Bank, it's a Johnny-come-lately. And there's tension between being able to do all these programs, these infrastructure programs, versus doing the anti-corruption and anti-money laundering so strongly that, according to some people, it may interfere with some of these other core programs. So to give you an example, the one part of the World Bank Group is the International Finance Corporation. The International Finance Corporation makes loans and gives technical assistance to the private sector. And it was the last of the World Bank groups to develop an anti-money laundering program. And so I was very friendly with the woman who was their first anti-money laundering person. And after she was there for about 9 or 10 months, at her request, I went and gave a an hour webinar, or not a webinar, it was in person to the IFC officials. But she did not last more than about 18 months in the job. Again, I gather that part of the problem was that she was trying to push the anti-money laundering program maybe more strongly than the officials at the IFC wanted, because they weren't accustomed to such a robust anti-money laundering program. And they also, when they had to push it on the private sector, who were their borrowers, they also received some pushback. And so, so that's just an example of the tension that develops between the people who run the loan programs and the people who do the anti-money laundering and who try to integrate the anti-money laundering, anti-corruption into the rest of the work of the IMF World Bank Group. And this is a evolving story. So, and that's where the networking groups like the Hunters Corruption Alliance, or the Corruption Hunters Alliance, comes into play. Is that that because it is a group of officials, World Bank and Multilateral Development Bank and international organization officials, plus civil society, they are constantly discussing how they can improve the regime and how they can make it more effective. And so, they're constantly trying to come up with revised programs and ways to better educate countries and better educate officials, and also how to provide better capacity for developing countries. So let me stop here and entertain comments, questions on anything. No? Okay. So if there are no more questions, then we will oh, there's one thing in the chat. When are we rebuilding governance? When we are rebuilding governance frameworks for another country, such as we did in Afghanistan, how deeply do we get involved in their current? Yeah, great question. I had to give a program on that issue for the Inter-American Bar Association. And unfortunately, we didn't get involved very much in Afghanistan. We basically looked the other way because it was a lot of times, a decision about whether we were going to throw out, high-level officials, and when it came time to confront them, And, if we were to do that, then we were afraid that, we couldn't really win the military battle. And so in fact, there's a very good, there's an excellent book by Vonda Felbob-Brown. It's called Aspiration and Ambivalence, Strategies and Realities of Counterinsurgency and State Building in Afghanistan. And I mean, she's with the Brookings. It's published by the Brookings Institute, and it's a great discussion of all of these issues, and how the U.S. failed to confront corruption in all the years that we were there, despite a lot of the reports by the General Office of Accountability. And so it's an excellent question. So
I was in the, hear me, Professor? Can you hear me? I was in the task force, was responsible for detention operations. I commanded the detention facility, and then built around the detention facility, JTF 435, which was the governance, the detainee cases, the detainee review boards to let them go, but also the rebuilding of the infrastructure and governance with respect to their legal system was kind of built around our task force over time. And that's what made me wonder, is that here we are, we're all these Americans. I mean, it's a joint task force rebuilding this architecture of how to get the country back on track. And then next door, right, all these things, this was it on Bagram Air Base, airfield in 2009, 2010. And so then Hamid Karzai is like right over there, and his brother doing things. And so apparently there was no connection between the two. Just very interesting. Thank you.
Yep. No, thank you. Okay, so let me now then conclude the session, and we'll resume again on Thursday. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.